Good evening to you. It's Mix 93.8 FM. The program is Risky Business, the heart of business, the soul of rock and roll. And I'm your host, Bryan Hattingh, with you as always on a Thursday evening to share some interesting talk, engaging conversation, and importantly, some great music. And the new lineup of the show, as my regular listeners will know, and if you are new to the program or haven't listened for some time, is Risky Business has a whole new facet to it, which is called Speaking to the Heart of Legal Matters. In partnership with Schindler's firm of attorneys, we bring you a conversation and insights every week on legal matters across the genre of all issues that may or may not face you, both in a commercial and personal capacity, with a view to making you aware of what your rights are and are not, and importantly, sharing great thought leadership from industry specialists, from specialist attorneys, and helping you to make better decisions about managing the risks that may face you in any form of legal context. My co-host in this regard and anchor person is none other than Megan Harrington Johnson, and she, of course, is with me as always. Hello, Megs.
Hi, Brian. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. And you?
Great, thanks.
We missed you last week, but we had a great lineup with Lone and with Pierre and with Lisa.
I missed you too, but I think that they want to take my place after this.
Did they? Good feedback.
Loved it. Absolutely loved it. The bug has bitten.
Fantastic. I'm delighted to hear that. We've got a great topic this evening, and great both in a somber and in a good way, because it really needs discussion. The new immigration regulations.
Correct. These regulations came in on Monday, so this week, the 1st of June, and have a massive impact on everybody inside the country and outside of the country who travels internationally.
So it's gazetted. This is now law.
They actually came in I think May last year.
Oof. Yeah.
But have been delayed and delayed and delayed because Home Affairs hasn't been able to comply. And they have finally been implemented, and we have received word that they have been instituted at airports and at borders across the country already as of Monday this week.
And there are 5 areas of categorization, aren't there?
Correct. So what I want to talk to you guys about this evening is particularly the aspect of traveling with children in terms of the regulations. And just to give you a broad overview, how the regulations work is that no parent is allowed to travel with children under the age of 18 if they don't have an unabridged birth certificate for that child. Now, an unabridged birth certificate is not the usual birth certificate that you're provided with when you give birth in the hospital. It's the long form of the birth certificate which Home Affairs holds and which states both the mother's name and the father's name on the affidavit. Okay?
That is terrifying, because I can imagine that in the case of single parents, or in the case of single as in unmarried or single as in divorced, there could be all sorts of issues that prevail with that.
Well, the problem, Brian, is not so much the unabridged birth certificate, but more that consent is required from the party listed on the birth certificate that is not traveling with the child to take that child.
Even if you're married?
Even if you're married. So if you are mom traveling to see granny in the UK and dad staying at home, and you're obviously taking kids with, you need an affidavit from dad saying, I consent to my wife traveling with these children to the UK on this flight, departing at this time, arriving in London at this time. And if you don't have that consent affidavit, you will not be allowed to leave South Africa.
Wow. That's hectic. And what are the instances? There are lots of instances that I can think of immediately. The illness or death of a family member abroad, where one of the parents and child or children have to travel urgently, and the availability of the father or the mother or whatever is just not there.
Well, there's multiple instances, and I have been having calls all week asking me questions about how specific people can go about allowing themselves to travel. And personally, I feel that these regulations are an inhibit on people's freedom to movement and could possibly be unconstitutional. But I think that to better explain that, I'm going to need to bring you back to the 5 scenarios that I spoke about earlier, and I'll do so
After the break.
After the break.
Indeed. And you are tuned to Risky Business on Mix 93.8 FM. So, Megan, you were going to describe the 5 scenarios that prevail in terms of this.
Yes. The 5 scenarios generally pertain to the different types of children that would be traveling.
Okay.
The first one being where both parents are traveling with a child. The second being where one parent is traveling with a child. The third being where a person is traveling with a child and that person is not the biological parent of the child.
Okay.
Number 4 is an unaccompanied minor, so you can imagine somebody going on a school trip or a school tour. And number 5 is a child in alternative care, so a child that's in foster care or has been adopted.
Okay.
Now, each of these scenarios bring with it their own anomalies.
Right.
If we go to the first scenario, where parents are traveling with a child, this is the easiest and most straightforward of all of the scenarios. Parents need to obtain an unabridged birth certificate from Home Affairs, and then both parents need to be present when boarding the plane or passing through the border with the child.
So let me stop you right there and ask you the question. I mean, that sounds fairly straightforward. Getting an unabridged birth certificate from Home Affairs,
Not
that
so
immediately rings
straightforward.
like alarm bells all over my head. I mean, my word.
So up until last week, I had clients that had applied for unabridged birth certificates after hearing about these regulations coming into promulgation last year, in excess of 9-10 months ago, and were still waiting for their unabridged birth certificates. Home Affairs has, however, just clarified that they have cleared a backlog of something like 7 years of unabridged birth certificates as of Friday last week, and no longer have such backlog. Whether this is actually the case, I'm not sure, but I know that I am still getting clients complaining that they haven't yet received their unabridged birth certificates. I think Home Affairs says that the waiting period is supposed to be 6 weeks, but as with anything to do with Home Affairs, how long is 6 weeks?
Goodness me. I mean, there are so many scenarios that could necessitate a much shorter lead time. Something's happening. It could be an illness, death in family. It could be a number of scenarios where you're needing to, and positive ones, not necessarily negative ones. You suddenly get selected to play for the school team that's going off on a tour of Europe or tour of whatever. I mean, come on. It's
Well, that brings us to our next scenario, and I'm just going to skip over number 2 and go straight to number 3, where it's children traveling with a parent or with an adult who is not their biological parent. Or alternatively, children traveling as unaccompanied minors. And in this situation, imagine a school tour of 20 water polo players traveling to Croatia. And this is a scenario that I actually have just had to consult on because a popular school, a well-known school in Joburg, has phoned me and said this is the problem that they have. They have this team leaving next month. Only 4 of the 20 boys have unabridged birth certificates. How are they going to go about getting these unabridged birth certificates? The parents didn't apply because the boys were only selected now, last week.
Right.
And what do they do about it? So that's one of the problems that we're going to encounter. The biggest problem, Bryan, is the second scenario where you've got one parent traveling with a child. And I speak particularly about single parent families, okay? Where a child is traveling with one parent, they need a consent affidavit from the other parent listed on the unabridged birth certificate, consenting to that trip and consenting to their arrival back in South Africa. Now, you can imagine what a logistical nightmare this is going to be for parents across the country and across the world, because you must remember that these regulations apply to inbound tourism as well and are having a massive effect on our tourism economy. But basically, if a parent is unmarried at the time of having a child, the unabridged birth certificate will generally only reflect the mother's name, mother's surname, and the child's name, unless the dad consents to be listed on the birth certificate, which often happens. People are more and more having children out of wedlock and are in permanent life partnerships, or whatever you would like to call it, and as such, both of them are set out on the unabridged birth certificate. Now, as often happens, the parties split up and mom or dad loses contact with the other partner and now cannot travel with the child out of the country because can't find the other parent to give consent to the trip.
What happened? I mean, let's assume, for example, the other party has passed away. Do you now have to go and get death certificates? Do you have to, I mean, what do you have to do there?
So in the instance of a parent passing away, you have to present the birth certificate and the unabridged birth certificate. The death certificate and the unabridged birth certificate at immigration when you depart.
This is insane.
Absolutely insane. The other option that single parents have is if they cannot get a consent affidavit or a death certificate of the other party listed on the birth certificate, they have to get a court order granting them sole parental rights and responsibilities in respect of that child. Now, to give you an idea of how difficult these orders are to obtain, I have only ever obtained one in my career. And in this instance, it was a father who had not been involved in the child's life for in excess of 12 years, hadn't even communicated with him during that period, hadn't paid a cent of maintenance, lived in a different country, barely knew that the child existed. And only in that instance was I able to get a sole parental rights and responsibilities award. In that instance, if I hadn't gotten that and that client didn't have that order, we would have had to have tracked down this father and obtained his consent every single time she wanted to travel with the child.
Now, the glib sort of comment from some people might be that, oh, well, if you can afford to travel overseas, you've got money. But surely there's quite a significant cost that's going to be attached to the more complex it is, the more work that needs to be done. What sort of cost is engaged in just generally in securing an affidavit such as these?
So the affidavits can be done at your local police station, but the risk is that if you don't see an attorney, you won't know exactly what to include in the affidavit. And none of us know exactly what immigration is going to require in these affidavits. As far as we know, it just needs to state the destination, the dates, and the consent. And that affidavit's only valid for a 4-month period. So every 4 months, you then need to get a new one. But it's incorrect to say that this only affects people who travel internationally and can thus afford it. In South Africa, we have a massive problem with people having to travel through our borders to go home. Remember, we have a massive migrant labor system. So if you've got people living in South Africa that want to go home with their kids to, say, Zimbabwe or Malawi, etc., they too are going to have to comply with these requirements. Otherwise, they won't be let out of our borders and, by the same token, won't be let back in with the kids.
Definitely then avoid for the foreseeable future traveling by road through border posts.
Absolutely.
Because it's going to be an absolute circus.
And we don't know what training the immigration officials have received. So how does your average immigration official at Beitbridge know what the difference between an unabridged birth certificate and an abridged birth certificate is, or a properly commissioned affidavit, or a court order, or a death certificate? You know, this entails so much training, and as an attorney, it's been difficult to grasp the concept of it, and to have it applied around the country, and also to try and explain it to all our inbound tourism is just an absolute nightmare.
Was there one particular intellectual gymnast who's the author of this, or who actually put this whole little story together? Does nobody know? It just sort of came out of the corridors of
straight from Home Affairs.
Lovely.
The Director General, I think, promulgated these regulations last year. And look, they do have a purpose. I'm not going to say that they're totally purposeless. The reason behind this is to try and curb child trafficking.
Right.
And international parental abduction, which is a massive problem that we face in this country.
Well, one of those very significant risks in life, and one can't look on it lightly. The reality is that somewhere between 1.15 and 1.25 million women and children are trafficked each year across the globe. So that is not insignificant. It's massive, and one has to acknowledge that. But somewhere in the midst of it, there should be some form of sanity and sense and sensibility, and a way to not, discombobulate our whole border and airports and,
and affect our
exit systems
economy.
and affect our economy the way that it does. So anyway, you are tuned to Risky Business, and that's the right program, The Heart of Business, the Soul of Rock and Roll. And we're talking to, of course, my co-host on the Speaking to the Heart of Legal Matters, new facet that is part of the Risky Business story. And we are bringing you the latest views, perspectives, issues and challenges faced by people, you, particularly the listeners, both in a business and private capacity, as you go through this time called life, and hopefully to equip you with greater insight and knowledge of how you should go about managing your affairs in this regard. And time for some music here on Mix 93.1 FM. I'm your host, Bryan Hattingh, the program Risky Business. And right now we're speaking to the heart of legal matters with Megan Harrington Johnson, attorney at law from Schindler's, who are our partner in bringing this to you. Going back to the subject, and we haven't left the subject of the new immigration regulations implemented as of the 1st of June, onto the subject of the really nasty subject about abduction. You've got some examples of an instance or instances where that's occurred.
Sure, Brian. It is something that I have to deal with, unfortunately, in my practice quite a lot. Not abduction for trafficking, but parental abduction.
Yeah.
And where this happens is when parties are separating or getting a divorce, and one party has ties to another country and skips South Africa with the children. Now, before these regulations were implemented, it is very possible for that to happen. All you need is the passport of the child to leave the country.
Yeah.
And about 6 years ago, I had a matter which sticks in my mind particularly, where the mother was from a European country for reasons of confidentiality. I'm not going to say which one, but she was from a European country and decided to leave South Africa with the two children in the midst of the divorce proceedings. And the children were 3 and 1 at the time, I think. And she had told the father that she was going on holiday and would be back in 2 weeks. And obviously those 2 weeks came and went, and she didn't come back. And Dad lost contact with her and the children completely and had no idea where they were, and had to launch all sorts of legal proceedings. There is a mechanism which you can use called the Hague Convention, which allows you to obtain the return of children that have been unlawfully removed. But this has to be done within a year of the children being removed. And you're in a bit of a difficult situation if you can't find the children for that first year, which was the situation here. Anyway, long story short, we landed up not being able to bring the children back for a period of an excess of 5 years. And by the time the order was granted to have them returned, the children only spoke that European language because they had been so small when they'd been abducted, and now had to come to this foreign country because they were returned. And it was quite a traumatic situation where the police stopped the school bus and pulled the kids off of the bus and took them to a hotel and put them on an undisclosed flight and flew them out to South Africa to this father that they ultimately didn't know. And what is right and what is wrong in that? Because obviously it's highly traumatic to the kids, but Dad obviously wants to have a relationship with his children, and what the mother did is completely incorrect. So these regulations have a place insofar as preventing situations like that. But the question is whether we have the resources and the ability to implement these regulations. That's the big question. And this week will be the big tell-all, I suppose.
Sure. It's actually really scary. I can't imagine the type of congestion it's going to create. Because this is obviously, as you're standing in the queue to go through passport control, you step up to the counter, and it's not just getting your passport checked and stamped. You've got all these additional papers that you've got to go through. So the selfish side of me says that they should really have 2 sets of queues. One, sadly, for those people who do have children and those who don't, which is very selfish and inappropriate. I don't see that coming right.
Don't hassle the rest of us that don't have kids.
Yeah, exactly,
Your problems.
Very selfish view. But I'm sure there are a lot of people that on the day when you're waiting to get to the lounge and just chill out and get to your flight, you're not terribly sympathetic about the system. Not necessarily the people, sadly, who've been victims of it. But, it doesn't serve well for people's stress levels and engagement.
Can you imagine the scenario of arriving at the airport not knowing that you need to have these documents? Imagine the panic that then hits. And unfortunately, people are only now beginning to wake up to them. They haven't been properly publicized. And this week is the first time that I've seen any mention of these on the news.
That's really quite hectic. And I'd imagine that not every country out there is up to speed with it. So people go and apply and they get their visas, and then they're coming through and they're uninformed. And
then they're turned away.
Not pleasant. Big risk in that. You tune to Risky Business on. In the studio with me, co-hosting with me and talking about the crazy, crazy world right now of immigration regulation and its impacts on you, the South African traveller. If you've got children at the age of 18, what it means to you and for you. And music that was played there was Michael Franti, Hey, 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 Sound of Sunshine. And before that was Hoggity Hog, Empty Spaces off the album Method to the Madness. If you want to stream, do so on www.mixfm.co.za. And just to know that on this day in 1784, Elizabeth Tibble was the first woman to fly in an untethered hot air balloon. Her flight covered 4 kilometers in 45 minutes and reached 1,500 meters in altitude, estimated height. In 1896, Henry Ford completed the Ford Quadricycle, his first gasoline-powered automobile, and gave it a successful test run. And in 1970, Tonga gained independence from the United Kingdom. In the studio with me, Megs Harrington Johnson, attorney at law at Schindler's, who are the partners in the part of the program called Speaking to the Heart of Legal Matters. We're wanting to keep you informed and enlightened as to exactly where you stand and what are and are not your rights. Right now we're talking about the concerns we have around the new immigration regulation. Megs, what are your thoughts there?
Well, Brian, aside from the effect that it's going to have on our tourism, which I have been told is going to be massive, I was actually on ENCA last week with a member of the travel industry who said that it is already having massive implications. For instance, their Asian market that would normally come to South Africa for game viewing, etc., is now bypassing South Africa and rather going to Botswana or Namibia, as you would do, because you would rather go to where it's easiest. But that aside, my biggest concern with the regulations is that it's going to ultimately, I think, prejudice the rights of unmarried dads. And my reason for saying this is that if the mom has the choice of including the dad on the unabridged birth certificate at the time of the birth, but knows how difficult it's going to make her life if they ever split up, the mom's not going to include him.
So it's okay to not be included if you're not married?
So generally you wouldn't be included. Generally, if you're not married, it would just be the mom and the child.
Okay.
If you're married, it's mom and dad and child. But if you're unmarried, normally just the mom, unless mom and dad consent to dad being on the affidavit. And if it was me and I was in that position, obviously being as informed as I am, I would absolutely not include anybody that I'm not married to on the birth certificate of our children, because I wouldn't want to be hindered by being tied to them for the rest of my life like that.
Yeah.
And it's ultimately going to become a tool that people are going to use against each other. No, I will not sign this affidavit unless you agree to this decrease in maintenance, etc., etc., etc.
Now, when we last chatted on radio, we were talking around family law, etc. One of the terrifying statistics you shared with me was that the most the largest number or category of families in South Africa is that of a single
parent female family. Correct. That is now the norm in South Africa.
That's the norm.
So this is something that's going to be very, very wide-reaching and have massive ramifications.
Surely. And I mean, we can't, that issue of the tourism, I mean, tourism has to be one of our biggest revenue generators. And the thought of what that could ultimately impact on at a macro and micro level is really scary. And in an economy that in many respects is still, holding its own, not a good idea. Particularly with all the unemployment figures that we've got. Last week, looking at the figures of 36.2 overall unemployment and 26.4, I think it was the direct unemployment rate. That's a shocker.
Yeah, look, as I said last week when I was chatting to the guy from the Holiday Factory on air, he said to me that he had already had an example where a trip had been booked through his travel agency of 10 fathers and sons going on a fathers and sons hunting week to South Africa, to one of our game lodges. And when they were told that they had to go and find unabridged birth certificates and get consent forms from all of the mothers that weren't traveling with the kids, they immediately changed their destination and said, look, we're not going to South Africa anymore. We can go hunt game elsewhere.
You see, South Africans don't have a choice. So, I mean, they're here, and if they want to travel outside, they've got to actually get it. And there's no, option of, I'll go somewhere else.
Correct.
Whereas offshore, it's very easy. No, I'm not going to go there. I'll change my destination. Well, South Africa's not the only holiday destination in the world, by any shade of the imagination.
And we do it all the time. South Africans going overseas will always pick the place without the visa requirements. And that's what's going to end up happening to us.
Absolutely. You tune to a Risky Business, the heart of business, the soul of rock and roll, and speaking to you on the heart of legal matters. And I'm your host, Bryan Hattingh, with you up until 8 o'clock. With me, Megs Harrington Johnson, attorney at law with Schindler's firm of attorneys. And we bring you this particular feature every single week here on Mix 93.8 FM. Good news. SA Charity wins Saville Foundation Pan-African Awards for Entrepreneurship in Education. And what our normal class time looks like at Imagine Scholar, we are very discussion-based. UK-based charity Teach a Man to Fish has announced Imagine Scholar as the winner of the 2014 Saville Foundation Pan-African Awards for Entrepreneurship in Education. The competition has awarded organizations from 38 different countries with a total of $50,000 in prizes. Competition was established to reward organizations in Africa that are taking an innovative, entrepreneurial and sustainable approach to education. Over 500 different organizations from across the continent, from Sudan to South Africa, Nigeria to Namibia, and Burkina Faso to Burundi, took part in the competition. All the evidence shows that programs which are innovative, sustainable, are the most effective way to address educational challenges. This competition draws international attention to organizations' achievements so others can learn from their success and imitate their approach. Commented Nikki Kaftka, the director of Teach a Man to Fish. Students doing group work and critical thinking challenges. Imagine Scholar will be awarded $10,000 as the winning organization, as well as a sponsored trip to an international conference and peer training workshop, business guidance, media publicity and enhanced sponsorship and donation opportunities. Imagine Scholar is a highly intensive youth development program in the disadvantaged Umkomazi region of South Africa. Since 2010, the organization has worked with secondary school students to enhance critical thinking, build character, develop effective communication skills, and create community action projects. Ultimately, it aims to empower young leaders with the tools to improve their futures and the future of their communities. Well, that's fantastic news, and just one lovely quote here from a 12th grader. Imagine Scholar has given me the freedom. I don't look at life just as a challenge to overcome anymore. I see life as an experiment where I get to understand who I really am and what I can do to make this a better world. A 12th grader Zinzi, now in her 4th year of the program. And there we go. I mean, it's fabulous. Just let's hope they don't have to travel too much, because they might have difficulty getting themselves visas and clearance documents.
And unabridged birth certificates.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You are tuned to Mix 93.FM, and the program is Risky Business. And Megs Harrington Johnson, and who's attorney at law at Schindler's firm of attorneys, we're sponsoring the Speaking to the Heart of Legal Matters. We're chatting this evening about the very somber and sobering new regulation that's been implemented as of the 1st of June around travel regulations and immigration regulations in relation to children traveling under the age of 18, whether with or without a parent or an adult accompanying them. And it would be interesting for you to form some sort of opinion and to start actually doing some lobbying, because, you know, it is now law. It has been implemented, gazetted, all those good things. But the question is how do we take it and make it work positively in the way that it was promulgated for, which is to protect children from trafficking and from parents abducting their children in the case of broken marriages and divorces. Megs, your thoughts beyond that? I mean, where do we go from here? How does one work with this and against it in terms of when it's being punitive and getting in the way?
Well, I think the first step is just to acquaint yourself with the regulations. And to the listeners out there is quite a clear document that's on the Department of Home Affairs' website. So if you go to www.dha.gov.za, There is a clarification document relating to travelling abroad with children, which was just released last week.
Do you want to repeat that again?
It's www.dha.gov.za, and the clarification document is called Travelling Abroad with Children. So if our listeners could just acquaint themselves with what is contained therein, it's a 2-page sheet, which is far easier to make head or tail of than the actual regulations, which you need a law degree to understand. That would be step number 1. And then step number 2 is, I particularly am looking for a test case of sorts to perhaps challenge the constitutionality of these regulations, because in my opinion they are infringing people's rights to freedom of movement.
Well done you, Megs. I mean, how many legal practices are sort of bullish about doing pro amico, you say? Is pro amico pro bono? What's the difference between pro amico and pro bono?
So pro bono is particularly for people that can't afford legal representation, and all attorneys are required to do a certain amount of pro bono hours per year. Pro amico is something that you take on for free because of a personal connection to a matter or because of a interest in a particular matter. And it's not often that this happens, because your pro bono and your pro amico cases land up generally taking the most time.
Fabulous. Good on you. Gosh, there we go. You tune to A Risky Business, very appropriately named right now this evening. The Heart of Business, the Soul of Rock and Roll, here on Mix 93.8 FM. On the subject of constitutional, how does one as an individual in the world out there go about leveraging or accessing the Constitutional Court and dealing with it? I mean, is that an expensive exercise? Is it complicated? How does one go about it?
Well, in a situation like this, an attorney would be quite keen to take it on what's called a pro amico basis for free, because this is exciting stuff and making law and getting it through the Constitutional Court. And generally, I wouldn't recommend doing that by yourself.
Yeah.
So if anybody out there has any interesting cases, I'm happy to take one of them on.
Okay, but that's important. And a timeline of going through the Constitutional Court, is that a very lengthy thing? I mean, how would one deal with it?
Yeah, look, it's like how long is a piece of string? How long does any court case take? It's filing papers, it's waiting to see if the Department of Home Affairs opposes them, it's getting a date. You're looking at a couple of months or years, depending on if we bring it on an urgent basis, because we could bring an urgent application where, as you were saying, someone needs to get out of the country as a matter of urgency by tomorrow and doesn't have an unabridged birth certificate and is thus prevented from, let's say, competing in an international competition overseas.
Yeah, particularly, I mean, it applies to children that are very sporty. I mean, what happens with kids that are representing the country, that are swimmers, for example, or athletes that are traveling frequently overseas to compete? So this is not just once, and one has to find a way. This is like every couple of months. This is, certainly a number of times a year. I mean, this is just hugely punitive.
And especially with relation to children traveling for sporting purposes or for school tours, there's an additional requirement in that they need a letter from the party receiving them in the country to which they are going, confirming where they will be staying, who will be looking after them, giving the affidavits of that person. Now imagine you're, as you said, a semi-professional swimmer swimming all around the world, but you're under the age of 18, and every single time you travel you now need to produce all of these piles and piles of paperwork.
It's really tough.
Yeah.
And, I mean, one has to look at this and say, what areas of tourism, for example, are going to be the hardest hit? I suppose the game farms are definitely one. How do organizations that are in the tourism business manage this potential fallout and fall off? What does that mean in terms of job losses and those sort of things?
I wouldn't know the financial ramifications, but I know that I have been consulted by a number of travel agencies in the last month or so, just to help them tidy up their websites so as to enable them to inform their customers of these regulations. Because the better informed travelers into the country are, the more likely they are to come still. But it's going to be very difficult to keep the numbers as they have been with this added impediment.
Is there not an opportunity here for, and particularly a legal firm, to set up a dedicated service facility of accessing the necessary documentation, be it an abridged birth certificate, be it the letters of consent, etc., to fast track it for people?
Well, I feel like that's what I've been for the past month. But
really?
To try and deal with the Department of Home Affairs, individuals have to go there themselves.
Do they?
Attorneys
Okay.
can't do it for them anymore. We used to be able to with the power of attorney, but parties are actually going to have to physically present themselves at the department and fill in the forms to request the unabridged birth certificate.
Oh, I mean, that is just in itself so time-consuming. The sort of people who are traveling and having to travel like this are often people of influence and people of consequence in business. Taking that time out to go and stand in queues for hours and hours is not actually smart and clever and productive for South Africa and for the economy.
Yeah, even that has further ramifications, correct. It's not just the direct impact on our tourism.
And I think just people's stress levels, having to deal with this and particularly as a single parent. There's so much pressure on that person, be they most instances female, but whether it is a male or female, but let's work with the female. There's so much pressure on them to be mom and dad, to work, to bring in a living, to be cook, to be bottle washer, and all the rest of it. And now they have to have the stress of trying to manage this and engage possibly with a hostile ex.
Exactly.
That is going to take great delight in impeding their mobility and their travelling with the children.
Exactly, or even applying qualifications to that.
Sure. You're tuned to A Risky Business here on Mix 93.8 FM. I'm your host, Bryan Hattingh, and with me in the studio, Megs Harrington Johnson, attorney at law at Schindler's, and we are speaking to the heart of legal matters and wanting to in and through it, to even on evenings like this evening where the conversation is quite serious and quite somber, with very little upside and bright side to it, other than the fact that it will hopefully protect those children who could have been victims of abduction, whether for trafficking or by parents who are wanting to whisk them away to another part of the world. For the most part of it, it's a pretty daunting perspective for people out there and their children when it comes to travel. So, but for the most part, we just want to bring you good news and to equip you and enable you to go about your day a little less stressed and a little more informed and in control of how your world's going to go. You're tuned to Mix 93.8 FM, the program Risky Business, and we are talking to you about the rather sobering subject of immigration regulation as of June the 1st this year, the beginning of this week. So we're sort of coming towards the end of the show. Let's try and round out on a more positive note. Should we talk about running?
Not so positive anymore.
When's your next big swim?
So my next big swim is in July. A mad swimmer and myself are swimming the length of the Knysna Lagoon.
Oh, yes.
On the 11th of July of all days. I was told last week that the water is already at 8 degrees Celsius. So
you swim in a wetsuit?
We will be swimming in wetsuits. I think there might be one or two crazy people who don't, but it's 14 kilometers.
It's a long way, yeah.
Hypothermia is actually a very real risk, and at the same time we're running the half marathon in the morning, so it's going to be a very long day. But
is that connected, the half marathon, with that, or is that just?
No.
I know that's quite. It's the Knysna Marathon.
It's the Knysna Marathon in the morning, yeah. So we're going to run that. Most of us, I think there's about 10 of us swimming the Knysna swim, and then probably 6 people running the marathon in the morning. But if anybody's interested in making any donations, it is for charity. The funds are all going to a youth development centre.
Fantastic.
And people are welcome to check out our website at www.madswimmer.com.
Yeah, and good thing you don't have to travel out of the country with any young children.
Well, luckily I don't have any of those, and I am now luckily over the age of 18.
Yes. But just sort of getting back to the subject throughout the show, what can we say to parents to console them, to encourage them, and to help them just step back from the dauntingness of this? People who had trips planned now that suddenly see that might be, thwarted by challenges that they have.
Look, It is a hassle, I'm not going to lie, and there is going to be administrative red tape that you have to get through, but the regulations are there to assist you, and at least you can sleep peacefully at night knowing that in the event of an estrangement from your spouse or partner, they cannot simply abdicate the country with your kids. And that's the premise behind this whole thing.
Yeah, and your children won't be abducted for worse things.
Or trafficked for worse things, hopefully.
But, and one would hope that in and through this, somewhere, the system will be improved in home affairs. That through the use of technology and more efficient systems and the pressure that's going to be on them to be able for us to take a message out. I don't know what the message is we're going to take out about tourism or how to make it easier for tourists, but somewhere in this equation, there needs to be some sort of leeway to not suffer the impact that we're going to in terms of lost revenues.
Well, I must give them kudos in that you've seen from the visa centres that there has been a massive capital injection into home affairs. It does seem to be moving more smoothly than it has in the past, and just getting them to clear the backlog on the unabridged birth certificates was a feat in and of itself, which is extremely impressive.
Yeah.
So hopefully if we can start to be seen as a productive centre for producing these sort of documents and allowing travel into the country, it won't be that detrimental to South Africa as a whole.
And for those instances where people from less advantaged homes whose children might be fortunate enough to be chosen to travel with a school sports team or whatever it might be, does legal aid sort of help in this regard? Would it help in this regard?
Yeah, I would suggest that those people approach any of the law clinics, so the Wits Law Clinic, etc. But there is a threshold for pro bono advice, and I think you have to earn less than 3,000 Rand a month at this point in time. But if anybody is struggling, they're welcome to give me a call. I will help them out with some advice.
So anybody wanting to get advice, contact Schindler's on what number and on what website and all those good things? You want to give us the details? Sure.
They can contact us on 011-448-9600 and just ask to speak to Megan. And our website is www.schindlers.co.za.
Fabulous.
Like the list.
Well, once again, congrats for all the fabulous work that you do and the contribution you make, and for the really appropriate insights and thought leadership that you bring, and for being willing to help people in the way that you do. And wishing you great success with your training in getting ready for the swim and the run. And
I think I must go and sit in a bucket of ice sometime soon.
Yeah, sounds fabulous. And take care of yourself in the meantime.
Thanks, Bryan. Thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. That's Megan Harrington-Johnson, co-host on Speaking to the Heart of Legal Matters here on Risky Business, the heart of business, the soul of rock and roll. I'm your host, Bryan Hattingh, saying au revoir and a bientôt till next week, reminding you that if you're not with the ones you love the ones you're with. Take time to show and tell the ones you love just how much you do. Take some time to take care of yourself and be found guilty of many random acts of kindness, and surprise yourself. Take care. Lots of love.